There was more adventurous chess played in round 3 of the Norway Chess tournament, and I'm going to look at 3 of the games from this round, starting off with Maxime Vachier-Lagrave against Veselin Topalov. So Vachier-Lagrave with the white pieces, and we joined the game after 18 moves, just out of the opening. It's a very theoretical Slav. This position has been seen before. For example, Iescas against Shirov with bishop d2 and rook c1. I quite like that. Iescas eventually lost, but quite like the idea of putting the rook opposite the queen. Vachier-Lagrave thought for almost a quarter of an hour here and came up with king h1, which of course seems like a logical move. And rook e8 played by Topalov. This is prophylaxis really, because very often this knight is going to leap into d5 and the rook can then support the e-pawn, as we'll see. Bishop d2 played, doesn't look bad. You know, this diagonal could be very important. Queen c6, so pressure starting to build on e4. And here, well, I still quite like rook c1 for white. I also like a3. One of these moves, a3, is just to forestall b4. But Vachier-Lagrave played rook d1. And I'm not sure about that move. It seems to me, it would be better on the c-file. So knight b6, okay, black looks to be building nicely. I have to say this is an incredibly difficult position to understand. You know, with all the pieces on the board, only a couple of pawns exchanged. Fantastically complicated. Here again, a3 looks reasonable. Instead, Vachier-Lagrave played knight d5, and this is quite a misjudgment. After this exchange, well, perhaps he'd underestimated this move. Instead of taking here, which would allow white to occupy e4, Topalov played queen d7, an excellent idea. So this e-pawn is going to be ready to chug forward, this knight still protecting the square, and of course the d-pawn is really vulnerable. Bishop a5 tried, but the e-pawn just marched on. Obviously bishop takes rook would be met by pawn takes knight. So knight g1 played, but this is miserable. And after this, the d-pawn is dropping. I mean, it's obviously horrible with the knight on the back rank. Black's king is completely safe, that's very important. And after these moves, well, it was utterly hopeless, because now the long diagonal opens for that fantastic bishop. Oh, look at that vulnerable pawn there. Okay, the threat is obviously to play e2, so knight e2. But after queen c6, threatening mate on g2, Vachier-Lagrave resigned. Well, this can be defended with rook g1, but then knight g4 is crushing. Alternatively, there's knight f4, but that allows e2. Or there's rook f3, but then black simply takes on d6, and I mean, this is an absolutely hopeless position for white to defend. So just 28 moves that game, a really crushing victory, and you know, so soon out of the opening, and a very theoretical opening as well. It's quite a shocker. So bad day for Maxime there, but a very good one for Topalov. Okay, our next game, Hikaru Nakamura against Fabiano Caruana, the All-American game. Well, we joined the game after 38 moves, and you can see this is quite a contrast with our first game. This is a lot drier. Position is roughly level. It's equal material, But of course white has a very slight positional advantage, and it's this pawn, these double pawns, that make the difference in the position. If we could just shift that f5 pawn to e5, then I don't think black would have any difficulties at all. But with the pawn on f5, that means that white has greater influence in the centre. So there is a little bit of hope for Nakamura, and of course Nakamura is very persistent with his play. Black could wait here, for example king d5, and this is probably the best course of action. But white can try and win this position. For example, here f3, and you know, white can decide which of these pawns to push. It might be that white pushes with d4. It might be that he pushes with e4, maybe in combination with f4. Sometimes you might be able to play g4 and just nibble around the edges before actually advancing one of these centre pawns. It's still a tricky position for black to defend. Caruana instead played b5, and I think this was the start of his difficulties. I can sort of understand why he did this, because you know, these three pawns are rather fixed, you know, and if someday white can get in king c4, then that might be a little bit uncomfortable, perhaps looking to come in here. So I understand b5, but of course it does leave black with these split pawns. b3, okay, and these pawns can be defended by the king, but now white's rook has a route into black's position, potentially. So for example, if black waits here, which he probably should do, then white can think about some progress here. Again, it could be white breaks with one of these moves. It's unclear which one. It might be that he moves the rook to f4 before advancing with, you know, one of these moves, or maybe rook c4 and then d4. Or maybe f3, or f4 and then e4. It's still difficult for black to defend, but this is certainly what Caruana should do. Instead, he played g5 here. Now, clearly his policy was to exchange as many pawns as possible. Well, in many ways a logical strategy to try and reduce number of pawns and get closer to a draw, but this is a misjudgment. g5 is a poor decision. Nakamura exchanged pawns and then played rook h1, so Nakamura is able to break through into black's position, and this is really nasty. So this is what happened, rook h7. Now if black hangs around, let's say rook c7, then rook g7 is catastrophic for black. That pawn pushes on, but now the rook just takes on f5, winning position. So, well, again, Nakamura continued consistently trying to exchange pawns, but Nakamura played well. Instead of taking here, which would break up white's pawns, he played e4, keeping this central clump of pawns together. This is his major advantage in the position, and it works out beautifully for him. So Caruana continued exchanging. Now, king takes will allow the king up the board. That's positioning, that's dreadful. Black king is really completely sidelined at the edge of the board. So Caruana continued like this, exchanging pawns. But this is actually a very easy win for white, because the pawn on f4 is so vulnerable. So a pawn up, and this one is looking too weak. The king gets checked back. but it's going to find a nice square on f3. I mean, black can't actually defend any better than this. His rook is active, but it really makes not a lot of difference to the position. And here, for example, if rook c2, then d4, all white needs to do is exchange these pawns and then bring the rook round to take the pawn here. And if c4, well, I think there are several ways to win, but I mean this is quite a simple way, and then just bring the rook behind the c pawn. Two connected pass pawns will win. In the game, this is what happened. King b6, pawns advanced, and this is a kind of Zugzwang position. Here, Caruana resigned. If the rook moves there, then king takes pawn, and if rook c2, then again this move d4. So exchanging will allow white to win the pawn on f4, and if c4, then again the rook potentially can come to the c file. Okay, that wins easily. And if rook d2, then rook c6 check and takes here. It's completely over. Well, in the end, quite an easy victory for Nakamura, but I think Caruana will be kicking himself because, you know, he'd played very solidly in the middle game before then, and really, you know, I would have bet on him to make a draw in that endgame. Okay, let's look at one more game. Let's see how Magnus Carlsen got on against Anish Giri. Of course, Giri has a pretty good record against him. But here, Carlsen is a pawn up and things are looking pretty good for him. Black can hang around here, maybe move the knight back, maybe into f4, but it's a clear extra pawn for Carlsen. Giri gambled here. He played f5, which to my eyes looks like an absolutely dreadful move because it exposes Black's king. I understand what he's trying to do. He's undermining the pawn on d5, but even so, Black's king is in huge trouble now. So this is how the game went. Exchanging on e3 really doesn't help Black at all. So rook c5. So what's the score? White is 2 pawns up here, but of course these two now under fire. But great move from Carlsen. Bishop takes pawn. If this is taken, then queen g4 and white breaks through very easily. King g7, knight h4, for example. Really simple. Black's big problem here, of course, is that the queen is miles away from defending the king. You can see there are no defenders. So Giri played rook takes b5. And here Carlsen played queen e4, which looks like the most natural move on the board. But remarkably, rook f8 holds Black's position together, covers some important squares, and d5 is dropping, of course. In the game, Carlsen took on e5, and I mean this looks incredibly strong, but now the queen can come across to defend on the king side, and incredibly there's no decent discovered attack here. In the game, Carlsen exchanged queens, but after that, well, he managed to win the e-pawn, but it was a draw. But let's go back. There is a beautiful way for white to win this position. Bishop f7 check. This is instead of queen e4. Carlsen could have played this. So the idea is basically to gain a tempo, and only now queen e4. So Black doesn't have time to swipe a pawn, because queen h7 check is devastating. For example, well, rook g8 is an attempt to defend, but now queen f5 check, and I mean that's absolutely crushing. The rook's just break through to the king. Or after queen e4, king g7, there's knight g5, again threatening queen h7, but also after knight e6 check, this allows the rook into g3, and Well, that is also completely winning. The queen will soon join the attack, and the knight on e6 will drop as well, completely winning. So Carlsen still not on his best form. That game ended in a draw, so Carlsen still at the bottom of the tournament table with half out of 3. Hikaru Nakamura and Veselin Topalov lead after 3 rounds with 2.5. If you want to see all the moves of these games, then I would recommend that you check out chessbase.com, and you can see more detailed news of this round and indeed all the other rounds of Norway Chess.